I guess good morning, good afternoon. It's somewhere in between. For those of you who were here yesterday, you will have enjoyed the Kirsten and Rob tandem. So Kirsten, after depressing us, challenged us to design for the urgency of inflecting the net zero curve, but the urgency also of adapting. And then, Rob came later on to remind us, actually, there's hope in humanity, and it actually can be done, but we need to dream. So we will get on with it. I'll play the Kirsten part, and our three speakers over here will play the Rob part. So, fair enough. So let me set the stage a little bit. We talk a lot, obviously, about cities, and we know that cities, if anything, they do concentrate people and assets. They have a good side. It's the agglomeration effect. So when cities are managed well, they become an escalator out of poverty. They give people access to jobs. They give people access to services. And if you will, that proximity of people helps with the cross-pollination of ideas, the exchange of ideas, etc. That's the good side of cities. But they also concentrate risk because of that concentration of people and assets, which obviously gets worse if they're not managed well. So the reality, and you have heard yesterday and today, it's getting worse. So the global average annualized losses from disaster risks and extreme weather events basically was something north of $300 billion in 2015, projected to increase by 30% by 2030. So the situation is getting worse. We spoke earlier today, so for those of you who attended a panel over here, about the drivers of disaster risk. That's basically hazard, exposure, and I'm on the side that opts for vulnerability being the third of the tripod because of the heterogeneity of cities. So we need to account for the vulnerability, especially of poor people, who tend to live in the disaster-prone areas. And then we have the impact channels. We spoke about flooding, heat, water scarcity, etc. But let me start with a fact. The situation is getting worse in cities. So we had a study, which I've put in the shared folder drive for the Klosters Forum. It's called Thriving. And this study is basically showing that while cities are growing, the growth in unplanned area is actually faster. So we've looked at about 10,000 cities between 1985 and 2015. The human settlements have grown by 89%, but during that same period, growth in unplanned areas, in at-risk areas, has grown by 122%. So while cities are an escalator out of poverty, they're getting built not in the best way possible, and therefore they're becoming more of a concentration of risk. On flooding, there's lots of sobering pictures. We're talking about 1.8 billion people, that's about a third of the world's population, that are directly exposed to floods, and 90% of them live in low and low-middle income countries. So basically in, if you will, the global south predominantly. And we know that flooding is occurring maybe at 10 times worse impact than it used to be about 3 decades ago. On heat, you've heard, the imperative for Madrid on tackling heat. What's happening is, in the region that I'm working on right now, Europe and Central Asia, is one of those that are fastest warming and extreme heat. And the infrastructure is simply not designed for heat. And a lot of things we've heard from Kirsten yesterday about the air conditioning and the collapse, but we've also seen the tarmac in an airport in the UK that completely melted at 40 degrees Celsius. And we know also that's another one where vulnerability matters, because we know that poorer neighborhoods tend to heat up much more than the actual, if you will, richer neighborhoods in a city. It's, the materials in which they're built, the loss of the green cover, etc., that cause this. Water scarcity becoming a major challenge, and I think we're going to cover some of these issues today. But we're starting to hear about cities now that are meeting their 0 day, Cape Town, Sao Paulo, among others. And across all these, the impact on the poor is most exacerbated. So this, if it tells us anything, it tells us of the imperative of trying to plan cities better. And to plan better, we need to have better data, we need to have better understanding of how cities function, and that's going to be one of the pillars of our panel. The second part is we'll need the financing, and that's another sobering picture. and we've got David over here. So 4% of the largest cities that the World Bank works with are credit-worthy on international credit markets. It means they can go and access finance, they can go and issue municipal bonds. There's another 10, 12% who are credit-worthy on domestic capital markets, but the large majority of the cities are unbankable. And actually, in some cases, we do have cities that are more bankable than their countries, but they're constrained by the country's credit rating. And at the same time, in terms of private finance, and that's an issue that I want us to discuss also in this panel, it is a sobering situation. So we maintain at the World Bank a database called PPI. It's about private investment in infrastructure. And the last year before COVID, where you can look at a trend, we had $120 billion invested in basically of private investment in infrastructure in developing countries and emerging economies. Now, 120 billion, you might think it's a lot. First, the majority of it is telecom and power generation, so it's greenfield investments. 9 billion only are in the municipal sector. But beyond that, if you improve the efficiency of public spending by 3%, it's more impact than those 120 billion. So there's a lot to be done on bringing private investment. So if you will, that's the sobering part. So with that, I'm going to turn to our Robs over here, our solution provider. So we're going to start with Nadina. And Nadina is going to talk to us about her work on technology and about how do we get into doing two things. One, better measurement, better understanding of our natural ecosystems, but also better making the economic case for policymakers. Because if you want to go to a policymaker and tell them, please, we need you to finance adaptation, what is adaptation at the end of the day? It's taking a bridge that was designed for maybe the 20-year event and improving it to be designed for the 100-year event. It still is a bridge, right? So the thing that it's getting designed for is avoided losses. Now, avoided losses doesn't cut ribbons for ministers of finance. It looks like the same thing, but it's costlier. So how do we make the economic case becomes really important. Then we're going to turn to Jillian, and she's going to bring us into more examples of having made that case on the finance. And then we're going to go to Indy, who's going to basically wrap those two together, add in some technology, and talk to us about system rethink. So that's the flow of our panel. We're going to start, and then we'll open it up. So with that, Nadina, the floor is yours.
Yes, yeah, there we go. Hi, everybody. I'm Nadina, and I've been asked, as Sameh said, to talk about the role of technology in all of this. But before I do that, just a very important disclaimer that often some people get wrong about my work that I just want to be very clear about from the get-go, which is that I believe that technology is simply a means to an end. I think most of us here gathering at the Klosters Forum are pretty clear about what that end looks like. I think we all long to have more nature-rich cities, more biodiverse cities, healthier, healthier communities. And technology is a way, one of the ways, but I think one of the most powerful ways that we can get there. So to be very clear about that, I also want to make another disclaimer, which is that I believe that nature should exist and that nature should be protected purely because it is nature, full stop. It is, I believe, our duty that we were put on this earth to become stewards of that land and of the oceans and of all the other species that we share this earth with. And I believe that is what we're put on this earth to do. So nature should exist, should have the right to exist, should have the right to be protected, full stop. But we're here to talk about cities, nature-positive cities. And in cities, that argumentation of nature should exist because it should exist does not get you very far. Does not get you very far in municipal governments, does not get you very far with your citizens, does not get you very far in the boardrooms of private equity and property developers. So I've come to realize more and more that in order to get further along in those conversations, we need to be doing a lot more to accurately communicate nature's value. And there's been, of course, a lot of talk about these ideas of ecosystem valuation, right? Putting a price tag on what nature does for us. So I'll talk about that a little bit. But really what I want to get into is what are some of the technologies, some of the emerging technologies that we have at our disposal now that didn't exist even 2, 3, 5 years ago. And now with this emergence of artificial intelligence, big data, all of these other technologies that we have at our disposal, what opportunities does that give us in this world of building more nature-positive cities? So I'm an ecological engineer. I started in ecology and then slowly moved over to technology. And ecological engineer is kind of perfect, and it was a full circle moment for me because it was essentially the discipline that brings the two together. So in ecological engineering, the discipline itself has only been around for 30 years. And essentially, we are in the business of creating nature-based solutions, right? Thinking of how we can actually use ecology to solve a lot of civil engineering problems that we might face in cities. And my specialization within that specifically is technology. And I call that the Internet of Nature. So what are the emerging technologies that we have at our disposal to better map, monitor, and manage urban nature? But I would argue probably most importantly, what technologies do we have at our disposal to actually reconnect people to nature? And I think that's something that, I started this talk with, that if we don't even have a connection with nature, right? If you're trying to convince, whether it's a property developer or an urban planner or a citizen or an arborist even, if they're lacking that connection with nature, it becomes very, very difficult to have that conversation. So within the Internet of Nature, there is maybe about 150 different case studies, examples of entrepreneurs, ecologists, technologists, techno-ecologists, as I like to call them, the people really at the heart of the Internet of Nature. And I discussed many of them first initially in my research, and then now in a podcast, and also in a book, which we'll get to in a second. And what I want to spend the brief time that I have with you is to tell you about 3 of them, hopefully inspire you and see what we might be able to do with them. I want to start with trees. And I want to start with trees because they are probably the most ubiquitous element that we have of our urban ecosystems. They're also urban nature's element that perhaps offers us the most in terms of benefits, in terms of the benefits that we might be able to quantify. Trees, of course, we know that they're able to offer cooling and shade and evapotranspiration. The shade, of course, has all of these different economic benefits, but also all of these massive public health benefits that I believe are really, truly just at the cusp of understanding just what it does to our longevity, our mental health, physiological health. I mean, there's incredible research coming out now that not only the planting of trees and the increase of trees in an area increases our lifespan. There's also incredible research, and for those of you interested, there's a researcher at the USDA Forest Service called Dr. Jeffrey Donovan, and he's done incredible research to show that actually the loss of ash trees due to a disease called emerald ash borer was actually shown when you accounted for all other factors to have an increase in cardiovascular and in respiratory disease and cardiovascular deaths. And this is pretty incredible research because it's showing us for the first time ever that there are direct links that we can cause here. Having trees in your urban space is literally a matter of life and death, whether that's flooding or public health or heat, no matter way you slice or dice it. Okay, so we know that trees are important. Well, then it obviously follows that we cannot, of course, manage what we don't measure. And the problem, of course, with that is that we simply do not measure our trees properly in our cities. The best thing that we have at our disposal is something called a tree inventory, which is essentially just a database that shows you where certain trees exist, where your trees exist, what species they are, where they are, how big they are, when they were planted, their condition, most importantly. The problem is that the majority of tree inventories around the world today are done by pen and paper, going around to each individual tree, sending a tree inventory technician, and if your city doesn't have money for that, they might orchestrate a team of volunteers, of citizen scientists to do that work. Now, nothing about citizen scientists, I mean, those come up in example number 2, but there has been research that's shown that you do need a certain expertise to decide if a tree is in good condition, and even something as simple as measuring the diameter at breast height or estimating the crown volume. I've done this work. You can go to a tree, you can measure it, and the 5 people after you can come up with pretty radically different measurements. Well, why does that matter, right? Why does it matter that we have differing measurements? Well, it matters because all of that data about all the different trees we can use to model exactly what we're getting out of those trees. And of course, your output can only be as good as your input. And if your input is not that great, well then all of these, statistics and data and reports that you'll go to, convince all these different stakeholders you need to convince isn't going to be very good data, and people aren't going to trust it. So one of the innovations that I'm really bullish about is something called a smart tree inventory, which is essentially using LiDAR-based measurements, so the same technology that self-driving cars use to make sure they don't run into anything or anyone, and essentially creating a digital twin, a 3D model of all of your trees in an area. Ideally, you do this from the ground, terrestrial LiDAR. You can put the scanner on the roof of a car if it's a street tree inventory, or on the backpack or on a bike if you're doing it in a park-based setting. And what makes this technology so powerful is that it's objective, it's scalable, and you're able to do this at cost. I mean, this is costing fractions, and you're doing it in days rather than months and years, which you can imagine once that data had been done, it was often quickly outdated. And the one success story I'll leave you with, because I could go on about this for a while, is there's a municipality outside of Amsterdam called Woerden in the Netherlands. And they only had about 30,000 trees, a small municipality. They used LiDAR to map all of their different trees. And for a long time, like many cities, they had looked at their tree accountancy, if you will, as a matter of stems going into the ground and stems leaving the ground. Basically, in a typical tree accountancy, if you had removed, if you had removed 100 trees and you had if you had planted 100 trees and you had removed 100 of them, you still have a net gain of 100 trees per year. So that looks pretty good, right? The problem is that, of course, the amount of biomass that had been moved, right? What that tree accountancy doesn't account for is the fact that you've removed 60, 80, 100-year-old trees and you replaced them with 5-year-old saplings. And all of course, the ecosystem services that have gone missing from that. So what the city of Woerden decided to do is use this LiDAR-based metric and actually come year over year to do this analysis, and now has actually shifted what their definition of urban forestry success looks like. So instead of just looking how many stems were planted and how many were removed, we're actually saying what was our increase or decrease in crown volume. So the amount of leaf area that you have basically on a tree, which is directly correlated to all these different benefits. How much increase was that, and what can we do to actually incentivize the increase over that year over year? And then also in terms of your investment, it becomes very interesting, right? Because then you start investing not in planting more trees per se, you start actually investing a lot of money in maintaining what you have, in ensuring that the 20 and 40-year-old trees that you have can actually grow to become 60 and 80-year-old trees. We know there's fantastic research that you're better off having one huge mature tree on your street rather than 10 smaller trees. Those are actually more beneficial for your public health. So this is an incredible innovation that can get us there objectively and scalable, and actually be able to not only be able to put a price tag, but also to have real data to back up what that looks like. And I love this example because it actually shows how it's being used in practice. The second example I want to share with you is something called the City Nature Challenge. Have any of you heard of the City Nature Challenge before? It is a worldwide bio-blitz. Nobody? Okay, well, I'm so glad I'm here. So the City Nature Challenge is a worldwide, it's been happening for 10 years now. It started at the Los Angeles Natural History Museum in collaboration with the California Academy of Sciences. And the idea was very simple. These are two public institutions interested in getting more people, citizens interested in nature. And they thought, what if we could have this 4-day competition, at the time only between San Francisco and Los Angeles, big rivals of course. What if we could have a competition to see how well each city could map their biodiversity in a matter of days? So the community was invited using the app iNaturalist, which some of you might be familiar with. It's one of the biggest open source flora and fauna identification apps. Of course, artificial intelligence makes it all happen, not just with the classification of what a certain species might be, flora or fauna or fungi, but also what we do with all of that information. So that started 10 years ago. It was this fun little rivalry between San Francisco and Los Angeles. And then now, 10 years on, they just had their 10th anniversary. It always happens the last 4 days, last weekend in April, from a Friday to a Monday. And now nearly 1,000 cities around the world are participating. To give you an idea, just this past edition, over 100,000 people across the world participated. Nearly 3 million observations were made. They had the highest number of observations, over 1 million in one day, on iNaturalist. And nearly 100,000 species were identified, of which nearly 5,000 of those were actually endangered species as well. So this is an incredible thing. On the one hand, you're creating biodiversity data that, you know, the most ambitious municipal governments around the world would never even have thought possible, right? Because there's no amount of resources that can get you that scale of that many people on the ground mapping all of this biodiversity and having it all geotagged. But you're doing something else which is critically important, which is getting that community buy-in, getting people outside. Like, as I always like to say, like, if you don't use it, you lose it. And that's the big thing that we have, is even if there are nature spaces in our cities and natural areas, if we don't get people outside and have those spaces accessible and being used, then how can we ever imagine that someone is going to protect them? And the third example I'll leave you with is, we talked about trees, we talked about, you know, all kinds of flora and fauna species, the biodiversity component. The one factor that almost always gets forgotten in the urban nature context, with the exception of soil, is insects. Insects are one of the most important biomarkers that we have for healthy ecosystems, yet they are often forgotten about. We talk about them a lot, right, in the agricultural sense, but we're still dealing with a lot of insect stigma, right? Like, insects have had a really, really bad PR, right? People don't like them, they're creepy crawly, they don't make us feel good, yet they're so incredible and we need them, right? They are, like, as I like to say, like, insects form the hammock of all life on Earth, right? And we so far only have had anecdotal evidence in terms of just how much that hammock is fraying. Like, the best estimates that we have are that 40% of insect biodiversity has decreased over the last 25 years. But again, a lot of that has been very small studies. It's been anecdotal. Like, one example that people often like to use is, remember when you were a kid and maybe you were driving up to like a cabin or a wilderness area to go camping with your family, and, you know, you would drive through the, you know, a forest environment, and your windshield would just be covered in bugs, right? And you'd be like, ooh, gross, all these bugs, right? And now maybe when you do the same thing with your own children, right, you have a clean windshield. That's something that people like to talk about a lot. So anecdotal evidence, that's the big problem here. We know that it's happening, but we're not sure by how much. And then when there's a ton of both regulatory frameworks, but also a lot of investment going into increasing biodiversity in cities, how can we possibly measure that, right? How can we possibly know that all that money that's being poured in, right? We're talking less and less about carbon emissions. We're talking more and more about increasing biodiversity, which I think it is an incredible transition. But how can we really know that it's working? So there's an innovation that came out of Leiden University and Naturalis University, which is the biodiversity center in Leiden in the Netherlands. And they created something called the diopsis camera, which stands, I always forget, it's like digital identification of something. But diopsis is also the genus name of these two stalk-eyed genus of insects. So that's where the name comes from. And essentially what it does, it's a very simple kind of contraptions. You have a yellow kind of a landing runway, if you will, a yellow kind of sheet, and that's what attracts flying insects. And the moment that the insect lands on it, a sensor goes off and a photo is taken. And then with the help of AI, we can not only classify what insect that is, but also measure its biomass. This was developed about 5 years ago, so they've been a series of pilot projects. There's about 100 of them deployed, mainly in the Benelux region, but around Europe as well. And I got the opportunity to interview one of the founders of this project. And I said, well, this is incredible. Like, we have, for the very first time, this way to objectively measure at least the abundance and the biomass of flying insects. You know, what an incredible way that we can finally use this. And he, like, spoken like a true entomologist, someone who studies insects, is like, yeah, well, but, you know, data is just data. And, you know, you need people like me to actually go in and know what to do with that data. And that's kind of also one of the points that I want to leave you with is data and technology are incredible, but only as incredible as our use case for it. And we need to design that, you know, built in from the very, very get-go to know, why are we investing in this? Why are we potentially having more harm to the environment by using this technology? We need to really, really make sure that we're using this for good and using this for the purposes that we want it to be used for. And he gave this great example that he's like, you know, you might actually have an increase in flying insects in a certain area, but that increase in flying insects might be mosquitoes, for example, which if you have a rapid increase in mosquitoes actually shows you that you have a decrease in the ecological health of that system. So it's really, really important that, again, back to my point, technology is a means to an end. This is not about falling in love with technology. It's about really falling in love with the problem and continuously rehashing that. So I'll leave it with that and pass it on to Jillian. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nadina. And for those who want a bit of a drier complement to that, so at the World Bank we did something called WAVES, which is wealth accounting and valuation of ecosystems. So it's some of the economics that complement trying to make the case. But as you said, it's important, and I really like what you started us with, that protecting nature is a given right. We don't really need to make the economic case for it, but in this day and age, this is what we have to do. And with that, Jillian.
Thank you, Sameh. I think what strikes me most, you said that technology is a means to an end, but I think I can link it to investment in the fact that what is really needed today is to educate the private sector in investing in, well, whether it's climate mitigation, climate adaptation, urban resilience, whatever you want, you can call it, or whatever you think about. I think that's the key pillar, and it's probably the most difficult part today that we face. If I look at what we do at Pictet on the wealth management side, so it's really private clients, so we're talking endowed foundations, we're talking philanthropic clients, we're talking very wealthy clients. They are aware of climate change. They are aware of, they need to reduce the emissions, they want to invest in it, but climate adaptation is really something very new to them. So you do have maybe that 1% that knows about it, and it's usually the next generation where they know about impact, they are involved, they've been raised with this concept, so they're kind of aware of it, but they don't really know the implications or how to invest in it or how to actually use their wealth and their spheres of influence to act upon it. So I think that's maybe somewhere to start with in terms of how can we collectively educate the private investors in that sense of why is it important to invest beyond climate mitigation, to invest in the scenario that our cities and our world needs to adapt to, that scenario of +2, +3, +4 degrees. And where can we invest, in what technologies, in what infrastructure, in what systems, in what innovation? So I think that's part of it. Then the second part of the equation is that private investors want return. So as much as we all focus on the impacts, how do we also bring that element in the way that we sell things? Like you said, when you're in a board, you sell the technology, you sell your conviction, but you have to sell the return. So I think that's the second element that we need to educate on. And the third one is the risk side, because they want the return, but they don't want too much risks. So how do we find that, equilibrium in between both? So what we find today is that there aren't many ways, or there's not a lot of private sector investment in climate adaptation. I think it's 1% of project level market debt that is actually private investment. The rest is public. So it's a huge opportunity that we can capture, and it's something that we need to promote and we need to focus on, not just on the private client side, but also on the institutional client side, on the philanthropic side. And I think I urge you all to go to the workshop tomorrow from Jennifer and Nicolas, because you will be talking more about the public equity, the real estate, the private equity. I've got the vision from the private client side, so it's a bit different. But we have means and we have tools to be able to achieve those investments. What we're facing today, bearing in mind the macroeconomic and Trump being in power, is that we see some sort of backlash when it comes to sustainability, climate. So how do we navigate that? Because this has an impact, for example, on green bonds, catastrophic bonds, sustainability-linked bonds. Though these are great tools for private investors or institutional investors to invest in climate adaptation. But these usually yield a higher risk, and they used to yield a higher return. But today what we're seeing is that the return is actually equal to regular investment grade bonds. So usually the private investor will say, well, why do you want me, if I'm not really convinced in the narrative, to invest in something that's riskier? So I think here again, it's all about educating about those scenarios, and that it is essential to drive, our cities, and I think the world as a whole, towards adapting to our newest scenarios. So I think that's part of it. I think we have more options that are available to us. And I think one of the most innovative, mechanism that we could put in place is blended finance. So for those who don't know what blended finance is, it would be a public-private partnership where basically the risk would, 2/3 of the risk would go to the public entities financing a projects for municipalities or other projects. And then you would have the potential for private capital, but also philanthropic capital, to also invest in this project with the de-risking elements. And you would be able to tap in projects that private clients would have no access to in listed equities or private equities. So I think this is a true opportunity and something to develop, I think, in collaboration with the World Bank and maybe the IFC and the UN, because I think banks as a whole, we know that there is a market that we need to tap in, but we don't really know how to structure it. And we don't necessarily know how to sell it properly to clients because they still believe that it's very risky. So I think we need more collaboration with the public entities to make it more accessible to private clients. And I mean, I see it on a daily basis. We have those demands from the private client side. And this is, I think, maybe a breach that we need to focus on to be able to tap into that source of investment. So it's not going to solve, the whole, that is there in terms of capital that is needed. But I think it's definitely a mechanism that we need to democratize in the same way that green bonds maybe 10 years ago were not democratized, and today they are. But they still bear a lot of burdens for those who emit it, because you have the reporting elements, you have the risk elements, and the yield is not necessarily as good as it used to be. So we still need to be forward thinking, and okay, so how can we create those new levers to attract that private capital? So I think that's something that there's some really good examples of blended finance that we've seen, that some are managed in Asia with the Asian Development Bank, and they've allowed for private capital to be in those structures to finance like flood resilient infrastructures in Vietnam, and also like smart grids in certain regions of India. So for me, like, this is, at least on the wealth management side, on the really private client side, I think on the bond side and on the blended finance, though, those are the two mechanisms that we need to focus on. Then, of course, there is the public equity, and I think Jennifer will definitely deep dive into those examples of, we have those companies that are taking into account those solutions and investing in solutions and products that finance and that promote climate adaptation, and we can have that maybe on a broader scale, and we have those private equity and the real estate as well. But it can't, it's too small right now, for the simple reason that maybe if 90% of listed companies know that there are climate risks, maybe only 40% of them actually account or price the physical and transition risks. So yet again, I think there's also the question of, in the listed space, how do we price in those risks? Today, I think sustainability, I think the basic sustainability risks, it's kind of getting into the hygiene of things, but the transition and the physical risk, I think we're still lagging behind in the public space. And I think it's up to the asset managers, and it's also up to the institutionals to have those conversations with companies, to engage with those companies, to make that change, to price it in, because that will also broaden the scope of investable universe in a more de-risked space, I think, for private investors.
Thanks a lot, Jillian, and especially for flagging blended finance, because inevitably that's the way. I think Maybe I'll start putting a bit of a Rob cap now. So, I was talking about how hard it is to convince a mayor, to finance resilience because of the avoided losses. But, we have come across mayors. I mean, I was talking a mayor of a mid-sized city in China, and, mayor had, a resilience plan, long-term resilience plan, and was asking for World Bank financing. So I was like, what is it that interests you in that? It's like, that is my major contributor to basically to my city competitiveness. Like, all Chinese cities can offer land, can offer infrastructure, can offer cheap labor to investors. What differentiates me is that I'm going to be the one city that can ensure continuity of business, that it's not going to be disrupted by a flood, it's not going to be disrupted by any other event, because I'm going to take action to enhance that resilience. So I think the more we talk about these examples, the more we can bring, interested clients, and then we can structure risk, basically de-risking instruments. Also, in that, if you will, green bond, plain vanilla bond, I mean, I get one of the things that drives me crazy in my work is when I get a mayor, who starts talking to us about, like, I want to issue a green bond. I'm like, you need the basics first. If you can't issue a normal bond, you cannot issue a green bond. But then, when they start getting, some of the, cities that we work with start getting more sophisticated, and, for instance, South Africa, have a deep municipal debt market. We've got cities like Cape Town, like Durban, that we talk to the CFO, and we talk about, the issuance of a green bond. But it's exactly like Jillian said. Basically, it's like, 1 or 2% basis points over and above. So it's not, for them, it's not worth the hassle. The amount of reporting that they would have to do on the green bond for the investor is not worth the return. But they do it because they want to position themselves as sustainability leaders, because, again, it's a facet of their competitiveness. So again, trying to find those leaders, trying to, do a bit of a Nadina, popularizing the cases that are, successful, and sharing them to create more of a momentum. With that, Indy, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to start the conversation a little bit in a different frame and then work backwards. So, as was rightly said, we're looking at 3-degree futures right now. And it's worth recognizing, and I did this talk last time, but I think it's important to remember some of these things. A 3-degree future, you lose one of the major food baskets at 1.7 degrees. You don't have to get to 3 degrees. 1.7, you lose one of the major food baskets. Food inequality and food crises. We know in 2008, the Arab Spring was driven by food price increases that happened because effectively there were fires outside Moscow, which meant fertilizer costs went up. Right? So you don't have to get to 3 degrees. Yeah, if you get to 3 degrees global average, that's 5 degrees land, that's 8 degrees urban environments. 8 degrees urban environments. Now, when you start to look at what that starts to mean, you start to get into some horrific scenarios. And whether it's cognitive, whether it's energy, like for example, your railways start to buckle much more quickly. So most of our railways that were built with temperature ranges to up to about 38, 39 degrees. After that, they start to buckle. So the number of logistics failures increases. Your transformers start to fail. So you've got this incremental failure points that start to exist everywhere. And they are literally, I've been mapping these incremental failure points that are in the system, and you start to get horrifically shocked. Cognitive decline, so the cognitive performance of people, GDP function, all crime waves increase, domestic violence has increased. Like when you start to look at this, it's quite structural. And now why I want to say this is that I think we're facing a problem that when we talk about nature right now, I'm going to be slightly, the numbers I'm seeing are basically saying that most of our ecological bioregions are going to have to move 100 miles north or 100 miles south. That basically means what we're talking about is a geoengineered assistance of our ecological systems. The idea that we can just kind of go, hey, wouldn't it be nice to have nature, and we're going to let it go, just isn't there anymore. We're talking about geoengineered transitions of our ecological systems if we're going to keep them alive. And then you start to keep going with this problem, right? So you start to talk about our water systems. So we're pretty certain right now that if you look at the risk to the glacier systems, to the ice shelves in the Antarctic, you're looking at the Theiss ice shelf that will increase sea level by 65 centimeters by the end of the century. 65 centimeters average sea level rise means that in tides and peak storms, it's significantly higher. So you look at the level of vulnerability that's endured in the system. The reason why I'm saying all this is that what's becoming more and more certainly apparent in the world that we're looking at, and I fully acknowledge I'm marginal and we're on the edges, is that all of our responses require a type of infrastructure scale response. And I say infrastructure scale, not infrastructure. It's of an infrastructure scale response. So if we want to cool Madrid, we are almost certainly going to have to build a perimeter bioregion and an ecological forest and a cooling environment that shifts the ecological region in some way. We're almost certainly, yes, tree canopies, almost certainly going to have to rebuild and repower the aquifer. We're almost certainly going to have to build community energy grids because energy inequality is going to massively shoot up. And if energy inequality shoots up, you're going to effectively destabilize the social contract. You lose the social contract, there is no asset value. You lose the social contract, there is no asset value left in that city. We're going to see wipeouts. So reason why I'm saying this is that when we've run the numbers, it increasingly becomes clear to us that the language of how we finance this is one, infrastructure, two, it's coming out of a security logic. If you want to secure your cities and not lose social contracts, we're going to have to finance them on the basis of a security economics domain. And the security is not kinetic, it's energy, water, nutrition, information systems, minerals. You're talking about a completely different logic to market-defined logic systems. Because when you follow the numbers, I just don't know how to make the numbers work on pure pricing of those goods back into the market. If you were to pure price your food system, truly, you're talking about a 5x variable. 5x, you put it on your food system, that means internalizing all those externalities. You put it in your food system, we have riots on the street, it's all over anyway. So how we capitalize this future, I think requires us to think quite fundamentally differently. And I think it's going to require a conversation about security economics. The conversation right now in NATO, and maybe perhaps someone like Kirsten there is a conversation about whether the 5% target of NATO, out of that 5%, 1.5% should be actually about systemic resilience and building the resilience infrastructure of our places in a new way, and then by what is the capital stack that it operates under. So, and that means security of all the things. And then the other point, these are slightly oblique, but I just think I do think there's a more fundamental question for me of what is our view, what is our thesis on nature? I still think we're living in a slightly Western view of nature, not even a Western, a Newtonian Enlightenment view of nature. There is nature and the cultivated, right? Nature is something else out there. And I think that paradigm doesn't really work. The idea that nature is something else and we are something else is problematic. And as long as we keep that philosophical separation, I think we end up with an extractionism and externalizing logic. So in that, there are some beautiful historic examples. So if you go to places like the Amazon, you realize the Amazon is a cultivated open garden. It is a cultivated open garden. It was not a wild forest. It was human cultivated by building charcoal soils and garden. The level of biodiversity in there has been human assisted. So I think we have a fundamental different view of how we live and operate in ecological systems that are going to be machine assisted, right? These are going to be technologically enabled, but I think there's a philosophical conversation that's worth happening because I think it will change the nature of our solutions and the nature of what we play. And then perhaps the kind of other, this might be slightly more provocative, is the conversation about the public and the private. I don't think there is a private if you are a significant wealth holder, and I've sat with some very significant wealth holders, those that own a lot of wealth right now are seeing themselves as holding a lot of liabilities. They perceive their entanglement with the world because their wealth is non-divisible. Your wealth is non-divisible to the planet. And right now, all the factors that are showing us is that we are in basically a degenerative volatility moment, where the volatility is increasing and the baseline is falling away as well. And that means actually what's really valuable is systemic stability. So what we're about to see from, I think, most investors is where are the locations of stability and what are the projects that accelerate stability in places that I have assets. Because operating risk and development risk is no longer sufficient. Systems risk to your asset is a significant force on your asset value. So more and more wealth holders are starting to see themselves through the lens of a universal wealth holding framework. And I think the languages of public and private are actually problematic. They're holding us back. They're keeping us in an illusion of a 19th century worldview where wealth is divisible and separatable. It's not. It's fully systemically entangled. And operating in the forcibility of our entanglement requires us to use language. And I know it's boring, but the language matters because it reinforces a psychology of how you operate. If you operate in a theory of entanglement, you operate in a different way of how we engage. Now, the final point I'd say, and I'm not even certain that states are good right now and private wealth is bad. I think that illusion may not be any longer worthwhile holding. States, because they concentrate risk, may become forces of control and holding control more and more hard to stabilize a system. They may not be the beneficiaries or the agents that Rob was talking about of unfurling imagination because they are becoming more and more susceptible to risk and control. Significant wealth holders who can understand their universal entanglement actually can become agents of real power good here because they can operate and create new theories of value. And they can actually lead the landscape. So for me, I think I come to this forum for the third time, which I'm deeply honored to. I think I'm sitting in a moment of kind of systemic doubt about the scale, the nature of the language we're using still, and also what the pathways are. And I think the pathways are going to be increasingly different and increasingly divergent. And I think there is a really important mechanism that we've probably not discussed is how do we create new forms of civic financing mechanisms? I think cities, if you go to Stockholm, for example, Stockholm has breached its borrowing capacity. Stockholm can't borrow anymore. So when we've lost the borrowing capacity, how are we going to pool this? And I think what I'm seeing on the front line some of this time is actually industries stepping forward and going, right, 5 industries, say in a city, saying we're going to 0-point financing the electrification of the city because we capture the stability benefits of 0-point financing. So we're starting to see how do you pool risk together, create captive insurance mechanisms at a city scale to do real world hedging of those realities. Are we going to do it on real estate value? Are we going to do it on actually future risks? How are we going to take those avoided losses? Because if we can't, we're going to be certainly sitting in those avoided losses at a systemic level. So I think the questions are significant, and I think it's a really important debate at every level. The words, the philosophy, all the way through the scale of operation to the nature of financing, and then how we govern into those spaces and where the saviors are into those futures. And I think we should be talking about radical new ways of financing. So one of the conversations we're having in, say, between South Africa and Zambia is, can you issue quasi-stable coins on the basis of future ecological rights and issue them into the present? I think we're going to have to decentralize the production of money more fundamentally on resource-backed currencies if we're going to capitalize this future in radical terms. And that's my third horizon. I think there's a second horizon, which is central banks working from a security dynamic, and then there's wealth holders right now starting to arbitrage value and risk much more smartly. I think private wealth holders, if you're not factoring in systemic risk, I really think you're doing the greatest damage to your portfolio. And wealth advisors, if you're not telling them, my God, you're complicit in this problem, because the risks are evidently available right now.
Thanks a lot, Indy. I'm not even going to attempt to summarize what you've mentioned, but I think, starting to talk about security economics, and especially because of the prevalence of conflict, and, we live in a much more volatile world. I mean, especially energy, water, and food are the three tripods that we're working on in Europe and Central Asia. And of course, information and minerals add to that. On the need to create, if you will, new civic financing mechanisms, that's definitely a critical one. I think on public and private, the blending of it, but also the fact that solutions will have to be created in a very different way is definitely something to work on. And anybody now that ignores systemic risk is obviously living in a different century. With that, I'd like to open it up. David?
We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so keep them coming fast and thick.
Okay, thank you. Very quick and very, a couple of quick questions, and maybe prefaced by two quick statements. I completely agree with Sameh about this, the green bond, the incremental value. These incremental things are not really there. We did a green bond in Tanzania, the first one ever. It's not going to, the effort, it was not worth, well, I mean, it was worth it for we did it, but we need ecosystem change of financing ecosystems. I think that's quite clear. But two quick questions. One on the AI. I mean, and when my with the cup half full, one thinks that, AI will be so intelligent, it'll give us the good solutions, etc. But the cup half empty, AI needs a lot of energy, I understand. It might decide that, the humans are destroying everything. We need this energy for ourselves, or for myself, or itself. Has anybody thought about that? I'm sure they have. And so, is there a point at which AI, the interest of AI and the interest of humans diverge? That's one question. Second question. Yes, we do need a new financing ecosystem, public, private. They're really great points. All of that, but the thing about the public, whether it's connected with states or whether it's connected with cities, and the good thing about cities is that they're not states, and in fact they're a much better way of public accountability. But it is that question of accountability and agency. What scares me about private individuals, AI, etc., is and it was mentioned yesterday, I think, is that you lose the human point of being accountable and of having agency. Everything is done kind of for you, and you're not in that point of accountability and agency. And that's the advantage of cities. And I think another advantage of cities is they can overcome some of these risks of states. In fact, a city-centric world versus a state-centric world might be a lot better. And it was. I mean, states are relatively new. As structures. Italy, was a whole lot of cities, and as was almost everywhere at one point. And so, but the questions on AI and on the accountability issue. Thank you.
Couple of questions. I mean, at least we get the pulse from the room, and then the conversation will continue. Jeremy, and then over there.
Yeah, thanks. Jeremy Eppel. And thanks for a great set of presentations. Look, I've got not so much questions as a couple of comments I just wanted to throw into the mix if I could. And I think I've categorized them under science, finance, and policy. To Nadina's very, very interesting presentation on the role of trees. So one of the advisory hats I wear is with an organization called Nature and People Foundation, which has developed the world's first, what we believe to be the world's first urban biodiversity standard to use as a methodology for creating urban biodiversity credits. Don't think carbon credits. These are definitely a high integrity, highly measured, verified, and so on. But they provide a potential source of income to cities in a number of ways. I won't go into them all, but I'm happy to talk to people about it later. But they also provide a very defined way of measuring the ecosystem services that trees and other shrubs and other vegetation can deliver. So we hear a lot, it's great that we hear a lot about the role of trees in cities and the role of greening of cities, and I think that was underscored by the pre-coffee presentation as well in Madrid and so on. But which trees? The trees that the City Parks Department is familiar with and that they're used to having there, or what I might call the right trees, or the scientifically founded trees for that particular outcome. So if you've got a problem with urban air pollution from traffic, or a problem with heat island effects, or a problem with unpredictable flooding, you're going to actually want to use different trees, and you need a science base for that. A science base for Europe exists, and we're trying to expand it into other ecosystems around the world. So find the right trees and plant the right trees, because a 10-metre high jacaranda tree and a 10-metre high London plane tree do very different things for urban air pollution, carbon fixing, and flood management, and you need the right trees in the right species. So start from the perspective of what does the city need. So that's the kind of nuance to that. The second bit on finance is, well, I mentioned it, it's using, having measured the impact of planting particular tree species, you can then define, as long as they've been maintained and are resilient, abundant and diverse, you can then create bio-credits, urban biodiversity credits on the back of it. But the third bit is policy, and policy leadership I really wanted to mention. So all of this discussion, I feel, is a little bit in a policy vacuum. I say that as someone who spent most of my career in UK and international governmental organisations. And without political and policy leadership, you will not achieve these outcomes. Same with building design, same with building codes, same with nature-based solutions. So you need that. You need leadership. And I think there also needs to be a link to the financial dimension. And in another organisation I'm involved in, Nature Finance, we've just done a report on nature as a shock absorber. And it's looking at financial resilience from using KPIs, measures of outcomes in the forests in Ghana as a way, Ghana's suffering terribly from cocoa production losses and sales losses, as a way of improving its financial resilience and hopefully its credit rating. And that credit rating thing that you mentioned, Sameh, can also be true in cities if you can demonstrate, and the idea is to demonstrate, that using the right urban biodiversity can really enhance their resilience. So I think there's a lot we can do, not just thinking about nature for nature's sake, although that's important too, Nadine, but actually how you put those into existing financial and methodological frameworks.
I'm Charlotte Glazier, and I've just spent 20 years in local authorities and working on climate adaptation, and I ran a research project in scaling up green infrastructure in urban areas, and which is funded by DEFRA. So I just wanted to quickly share some points that of interest, and the scale up of nature in cities, just looking at the environmental impact, is not scalable. It's eye-wateringly expensive from a finance perspective. So we have to include all the sort of social impact and social value aspects to create a new case for it, because on its own, just the environmental benefits don't stack up. And then looking at the bonds, when looking at, say, low traffic neighborhoods, which are reducing pollution and creating new opportunities, that is kind of tucked in and embedded into some of the municipality bonds. But why? Because actually it's about parking traffic enforcement, which is where the return on investment is, which is basically saying we want this system to fail so that we can get the income. So it's all twisted. And then another point, if there's no point in driving new capital models unless we get the baseline of the revenue and the maintenance models first. So that's kind of where I'm at. And yeah, I just thought I'd share some findings, and if anyone's interested, I'm happy to expand. Thank you.
Maybe a more philosophical question, coming back to this point between the public and the private. And you talked a lot about motivating investors to protect their assets, but how would you motivate them to protect the people that are around these assets? And what is the incentive where traditionally it was more the public that had this people-centered security or protective function, especially in a world where KI might decrease the value of people as workers and as assets?
So we've only got 5 minutes to try and get through all of these questions. Sameh, do well with the panel. Do as well as you can. Thank you.
I thought I was going to do like the other panel. We take the questions and then we say we're going to converse over lunch. But okay.
So maybe I'll tackle your last question. I think from the conversations that I've noticed, you don't need to motivate them about, it's not just about protecting their assets, it's also, when you talk to private clients, it's about protecting the next generation. So it's about protecting their families. So I think it starts there. It's protecting their people and the generations to come. It's about transmission, preserving and growing. So I think it goes way beyond just protecting your revenue and your assets when you have those conversations with them. And when you have the conversations with their children, they're already aware that it's about even beyond the people, it's about protecting your people and your planet. So I don't think I need, at least from my perspective, I don't need the convincing on that side. I think where I need the convincing is more on the education side. I think it's about understanding the systems change. I think people around here, we all are aware of that, but I think most of the people that I talk to are not necessarily versed on systems change and how we need to rethink. Basically, like you said, I think nature is not just what we perceive it today. Public and private, maybe the roles need to be shifted. So for me, it's more about education on systems change, education on what living in 3-degree world means, but not about protecting the people.
I think to Charlotte and to Jeremy's point, something that I've been really interested in is how do you put a price tag? I mean, we talked a little bit about ecosystem service valuation, about public health, but one thing that I think we've all seen is that often urban nature falls into the hands of municipalities, right? They take all of the risk, have to carry all of the liability, have to deal with all of the maintenance, right? The capital investment, getting the one-time financing to do a tree planting project, that's easy. Only for 6 months later, all of those trees to be dead, right? I think we've all seen this happen all over the world. And it's the maintenance side of things that's a lot less sexy, that takes a lot longer, that's a lot more difficult to get the money for. So I'm excited about this focusing on crown volume because it changes the incentive to actually focus on maintenance and maintaining what we have, preserving what we have, rather than just planting new, like the ultimate kind of greenwashing. But one of the things that we see a lot too is if the public domain holds all of the risk, we have all these benefactors that are in the private, right? So we have hospitals that we know that if patients are looking out the window to a green area, they're going to be in the hospital less long, they're going to take less medications, it's going to be good for the hospital. We know that if it's universities and schools, their students are going to be more productive, they're going to have better cognitive development. If it's office buildings looking out or having access to a green area, they're going to be taking more less sick days and maybe more sick days to enjoy it. And be more productive and all of these different things. So we have had for a long time, the public, and I really like what you said, Indy, about changing the two. It's like that's something I'm really interested in continuing the conversation on is how do we get the private sector investing in urban nature, not just because it looks good on their impact report, but because it really, I loved your example from the mid-sized city in China, the mayor, because it differentiates their business, and ultimately it's really, really good for the bottom line. So if any of you have any ideas about that, please come find me, because I'd love to continue the conversation there. And I just wanted to briefly say all of the examples that I mentioned are in my book, The Nature of Our Cities, which I'm going to leave in the reading corner. And it's a gift to the person that it resonates with most. So please don't all come at once.
I'm going to get it right now. 3 things I'll just be quite fast on. Well, my intuition is that the asset is not the trees, but the value it gain as a result of removal of 8.5 degrees of Madrid's temperature rise and peak. I think the asset is different. If you acidify the trees, there's a whole bunch of problems comes. If you take a synthetic portfolio view on 8.5 degree reduction, and that's your strategic asset, there's a different calculation that comes. And that's intuitively where a lot of our work is going. Second thing, I think cities, yes, but cities as aggregators of risk and liability and value, not cities as representative systems, but actually as functional aggregators of the pooling of risk. And I think as soon as cities do that, they start to organize differently. And I think there's something really important there. And finally, I think latently, and I really appreciate your point, most of our risk is coded towards assets, not humans. And if you look at what's happening at a macroeconomy level, our economy is moving towards a war economy. So if you look at the return on assets and you look at the return on war machine infrastructure, it's all moving there. At the same time, if you look at the return on labor, it's flatlining and declining. And with AI, it will probably do the same. So I think there is something fundamental about what does it mean to be human in this moment, where actually the risk profile won't necessarily come down to humans. And I think there's a very nice and important point that you raise about how do we really talk about risk, not just to assets, but systemic. And this is the point I was trying to make, that the social contract will destroy all real estate asset value anyway. So that's the reason why I'm re-entangling the social contract with asset value. And that's why public and private for me is a problem, because I want investors to see their risks through an entangled viewpoint and a non-divisible viewpoint rather than a separationist viewpoint. But I think there's something really important in that AI conversation which we can have as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so I wanted to add a couple of points and then we wrap up 1 minute. Reference to Viola's question, now, how do you talk about the protection of poor people where there are no assets, you know? So I wanted to reference some work that we've done together with Sheila, so both SDI and the World Bank, where during COVID, Sheila's team went down in various cities and mapped public infrastructure, which is very limited in slums. And on our end, we did modeling basically on the population densities and the increased exposure risk to COVID that concentrates from those few, if you will, infrastructure points, because everybody has to go to the toilet, to the water stand pipes, etc., how basically risk propagates over there. That type of dialogue helped us a lot with the mayors to explain the importance of investing in slums, because at the end of the day, the city is a labor market. So if you lose your labor, if, you know, the people who work, and by the way, I mean, slums are not, you know, the perception that they're the bottom 20, 30% on the income distribution is completely false, because slums are very varied in their income distribution. I mean, in Rio, and I did some studies at the time when I was working in Brazil. I mean, in Rio, it's like 70% or 80% of the income distribution lives in the favelas. So it's a much more heterogeneous, and it's predominantly a major labor market. So a city cannot function without the population of its informal settlements basically being able to function. So it's the, if you will, the health and productivity angle. On Charlotte's point, on the main aspect in which we could generate value, fiscal value. I'm not going to talk about economic and social, but fiscal value out of investing in resilience is basically urbanization investment. So you invest in reducing the flooding risk of a given parcel of land, you increase the urbanization potential of that land, and it's basically land value capture to recover part of the cost of this investment. So urbanization creates you that value. It doesn't mean we've got the solution fixed for every other aspect of resilience, but there are avenues out there. Tackling systemic risk, understanding what systemic risk means, and being able to incorporate that to become part of your financing package, that there is a dividend that comes out of it, the competitiveness of mayors on resilience fronts, etc., are all new frontiers, but it's starting to happen. With that, a round of applause to this excellent Okay, a round of applause, but we go to Kirsten. We spoke so much about her. So
I just had one really, really quick small build to make a bridge to the present on this whole question of investing in humans or assets. Currently, when we insure homes, we say that we're insuring a home. We're never insuring a home. We're insuring the relationship between someone who lives in it, who cares enough about it to put locks on the doors, clean the windows, clean the gutters, and in any form of urban environment. We already have ways of understanding that entanglement. We just need to start seeing them as a really quicker bridge into doing some of this.
Kirsten, thank you very, very much for closing us off. Panel, thank you ever so much.